Hello, my name is Scott Gruber, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about some ideas I've been thinking about, how I approach web design. I've been working on the web for 20 years, and in my design process, I'm very cognizant of three principles of accessibility and performance and aesthetics. For me, I'm going to start with the basic foundations, the building blocks of the web. And for me, it's HTML and CSS and just a pinch of JavaScript. That's what I started with when I began building websites. And it's really kind of easy compared to what it used to be like. I would build a page with some HTML, add some CSS for some styling, and then FTP it up to the server. And that was kind of it. Now it's gotten a little more complicated. There's a lot of acronyms and a lot of frameworks and a lot of fads that have come down the pipeline that really help to build a strong interactive web, but I think have kind of complicated things a little bit. It kind of even makes me nervous just thinking about it. I just wanted to have everyone take a deep breath. Just breathe for a moment. And maybe you can empathize a little bit with some of the difficulties of learning these frameworks. I think it gets a little bit hectic, constantly churning through new technologies and new things that you have to learn that can take away from the fundamentals of good design. Feel better now? And for me, I'm always coming back to the kinds of people that use the internet. It's so important to remember that ultimately it's a communications medium. It's oftentimes hard to get a sense of audience on the web, but I still, in my mind, I'm always thinking of the user, and in fact want to call them the audience more than just users, because they are real people. A lot of times people think it's millennials who are the key demographic that you want to reach. And these shiny, happy people are really kind and really friendly. There's these millennials, they're cultural icons. They're considered digital natives. But I think actually there's quite a wide spectrum of skills and abilities within the young population that belies the stereotype. But who else is surfing on the web? For me, it could be a blind person who's using a screen reader. It could be someone in a wheelchair. There's quite a number of people who have some cognitive abilities, challenges that they're facing, who also want to access the web. You could be a businesswoman. Could be an engineer flashing a Cub Scout sign. And it could be a scientist and an inventor. Now, all of those people could be millennials. But yet, there's also senior citizens who are accessing the web. It could be your grandma. Everyone has access to the World Wide Web. That's one of the things that excites me about it. I'm always thinking it's a World Wide Web. It's international, it's global. And it's important to remember that when you're building websites. Make sure that it's as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. How do these folks access the web? It's really hard to predict. It's not just a desktop. This is the web. People are accessing it through such a wide range of devices. It's kind of hard to predict what they're going to be using. And it's really kind of hard to think in your mind, can I design a page like I used to in print that have specific dimensions? Can I do a design that is geared for desktop? A lot of times you'll get a comp that's in Photoshop and it's pixel perfect. But as soon as you start translating it to the web, it falls apart. It doesn't hold because of this nature of all these devices that you have. And for me, I've been inspired by many designers. And one is a gentleman from England. His name's Jeremy Keith. And he said, the web is not a platform. It's a continuum. I often think, what the heck does that mean? And one aspect of it is that I have no control. I have no control over the network. People can be accessing it with a really fast internet connection. They can be accessing it with a very slow connection. I have no idea. I have no control over what device they're going to be using when they visit a website that I build. It could be a phone, could be a laptop, could be a watch these days. Could be something that we don't even know has been invented yet. I don't know what browser they're going to be using. I don't know if they're working in a browser that's really difficult to debug. I need to develop, according to some standards, and some sort of anchor that'll hopefully work across all these devices, across the entire continuum of the web. I also don't really know how people are going to be accessing it. Are they going to be sitting down? Are they going to be on a train? Are they going to be, in a car? And are they going to be on a bike? I just don't know. I don't have that kind of control. And they could have some accessibility problems as well. But if I think about it, if I don't have this control, and it's okay, how do I approach my design process to take advantage of some of the positiveness and the uniqueness of the medium of the web? I can only control what I do. I'm not going to know how people are accessing it, but that's okay. As long as I'm designing to try to meet as many of these kinds of situations as possible, I think I'm trying to hit the mark. So I wanted to share a few ideas that I'm developing about my design process. And I'd really be interested to hear what your thoughts are on them, because this is definitely something that I don't have all the answers about, but it's something that I'm trying to explore. And it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit and talking with web professionals and web users and friends and family. And so it's informing my design practice quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to, after this talk, to be able to discuss it with some folks here. For me, these three principles, again, are accessibility, performance, and aesthetics. Those are things that I'm always keeping in my mind when I'm designing the site. And I'm going to try to highlight each of these kinds of principles with one kind of main idea to illustrate. But I'm sure that there's other principles that are important. And I know that there's other examples that can illustrate these principles that I'm going to talk about today. And again, I'm going to be taking the opportunity to hear what you guys think about this in a moment. Number one is on accessibility. The web should be accessible to everyone. And there's some guidelines, and some very smart people have been writing web content accessibility guidelines, or WCAG. I am a volunteer at the Patient Technology Council at UCLA, and they're very, very cognizant of people who have a wide range of motor skills. And I was able to share with them some of my ideas about accessibility and resources for them to be able to learn more about this kind of topic, because it is very important, especially in a patient setting at a hospital. One idea about accessibility, among many aspects in the guidelines, is about color contrast. The UCLA color palette where I work is this beautiful blues and beautiful golds, but there can be some challenges with the color contrast ratio for readability. Tried to put these colors up against black and against white to show that there's some variation in the values that can be projected from those. The design team really took the WCAG guidelines to heart, and they did all the color combinations that you can have and see which ones are more easy to read than others. And you'll see, yellow on white text gets a very low ratio. 4.5 to 1 ratio is kind of what you need to make a regular text readable. And if you have large headlines or display text, you want to have at least a ratio of 3 to 1. It's very easy to figure that out. There's some great online tools. Here's one. You can put in your foreground color and your background color, and it'll generate the contrast ratio quite quickly. But it's kind of more of a challenge to talk with people who are making aesthetic decisions, to be aware of the accessibility aspect of their decisions so that they're not choosing colors that are much more difficult to read. And I'm hoping some of these tools that people have can convince folks. And I hope people can empathize with some of the difficulties some people will have of being able to read text that's a little too light on a white background. For me, it's kind of, when push comes to shove, you should choose colors that have enough of a ratio that people can read them and they're accessible. It's not just an ethical principle. It's a in fact, a legal principle, that you do need to meet these guidelines. And there's tools to make it quite easy to do. And I'm really pleased that UCLA has taken the effort to be able to examine each of the color contrasts that they have in their palette to make sure that it's accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Okay, so the second principle I wanted to talk about is performance. When I think of the web, they need to load fast. It's really, really important. How fast? You've got 2 seconds or less to be able to capture someone's attention, or else they're going to go. So how do you make sure that your website loads really, really fast? A lot of websites have sort of a big full-width image. They're called Jumbotron, and it's kind of an interesting term, but these Jumbotrons often come with carousels. So there'll be 3, 4, 5 images in a carousel, and it takes forever to load them because each image has to load on its own. So for me, Jumbotrons and this kind of sample of a website are definitely something you don't want to use. You can't assume that your audience is surfing the web on a real fast internet network. You got to make sure that you're able to support a website for people that are using smartphones. If you're on a 3G network, and I'm sure you've had this kind of experience when you're using a cell phone out in the community where it takes a real long time to load a website, and you felt that frustration. Well, it's a privilege, I think, to be able to have a fast internet connection. But when I'm designing to make sure that a site is accessible and performative for a wide range of people, I need to make sure that it's something that works for everybody. And having very large images is just too much of a problem sometimes. So, what do you do about it? An important part is looking at all the files on a particular page and set a budget. How many megabytes are you going to have allowed on your web page? And you can budget. Are you going to put that into your HTML? You're going to put that into your images? You're going to put it into your web fonts and, or maybe even the ads. But it's important to have a sense from the craftsman's point of view over how much is acceptable. And it really can help you talk with your clients to be able to say, we've had one image too many. We need to separate this out, create another page, or find ways and techniques to compress the images. One way to do it is to try to use responsive images. One image may not be enough. Unfortunately, the web is responsive to these kinds of issues. And there's a new tag called the picture tag. And it's also a source set. And you'll see from some of this code, you'll have a 1 times or 2 times, and that's relating to the pixel density of a screen. An Apple Macintosh has a high density Retina display. That's very different from a lot of PCs that don't have such a strong density. So the images can vary depending on the device that someone's using. The images can be smaller if someone's on if someone is on a smartphone, because you don't need to have a big, wide, 1600 pixel wide image if the viewport on the mobile device is only 300 pixels. So the picture element allows you to load up a wide variety of images, targeting particular resolutions, particular screen sizes, to be able to possibly even art direct what photos are showing up. So instead of a large Jumbotron image, when you're on a mobile, you can have something that's cropped, a little tighter. It's much more specific and appropriate for that particular device. Again, the web is a continuum. All of this with performance and accessibility does not mean that a website shouldn't look good. And in fact, I think that you can have, if you're a good craftsman and you're attentive to these details, you can have a website that looks very good while it's still accessible to many people and it's still able to load fast. You just have to kind of switch the paradigm a little bit, have a little different priorities in your design thinking, and adapt your process to be able to solve these kinds of problems more than just trying to shoot for a pure aesthetic situation. There's CSS is so powerful. There was some experiments where people would have the same HTML file, but different designers would write their own CSS and come up with an entirely different kind of look and feel for a website. And so 2003, CSS Zen Garden was quite popular, and hundreds of designers did it. And I just wanted to show you a couple that illustrate, the beauty of CSS design. And it can be very different, although underlying this is the same HTML. Quite amazing to me that you can do such wonderful design just by understanding the craft of CSS. And none of those are impacting page load because it's not dependent on images for their design. In 2010, some of these issues came to of control came to a head because the smartphone really became popular. iPhone, I think, came out in 2007. Took a little while for the web community to come up with their solution, but responsive web design landed in 2010 as a term, even though it kind of had its antecedents before in liquid design on the web. And this idea of what responsive web design is, it's a combination of flexible grids, flexible images, and a thing called media queries. But the fundamental concept is that content is like water. It can flow and it can change depending on what the container that you're going to be pouring that water into. And it's building the website so that it can more easily flow naturally into these different containers without the design breaking. This gentleman, Ethan Marcotte, was the person who invented the term responsive web design at a conference at an event apart. This is his site, and this is a very typical sort of approach that you'll see when people are demonstrating what responsive design looks like. You'll see, this site shows 4 different viewports. Each of them is different. Each of the designs are different. The images that could be loaded in each of these devices could be different. The layout, number of columns, are all different across these different viewports. And if you get into the craft underneath it, he's using some maths, and he's not in control over what the font size is across every single device. He's setting up some liquid sort of system that can flow and change depending on what the size and the viewport is of the device that someone is coming to visit his website for. That's a common sort of thing in responsive design. Here's another example of the Milwaukee Ballet across 4 different viewports. And again, they're using media queries to look at the width or the height of the page and changing the font sizes or the columns or the size of the images depending on what size of the device is that someone's visiting on. That's kind of at the crux of at the heart of responsive web design. But in 2017, there's a new CSS layout engine called CSS Grid Layout landed. And I really think this is going to transform the way all of us design and develop for the web. Rachel Andrew writes about the spec, and she has been a leader for the past 3 to 5 years going around the world working to teach people how to use the spec. And how to apply CSS Grid, and how to understand the new creative potentials that this new CSS layout engine offers. You'll see even in Firefox, there's some tools built into the browser that expose the shape of the grid. We've never had on the web a 2-dimensional layout that has columns and rows. And it's, just the way the specification developed. In 2017, it landed in all of the major browsers, from Chrome to Firefox to Opera to Safari to IE Edge, all have support for grid. And so you can see now we're moving into a different kind of an era where you can define rows and columns, and it's quite an exciting era for the web. If you didn't have to learn some of the old layout engines, you're going to be able to probably pick this up quite quickly. But it's certainly one that anyone who's a professional in the web needs to spend time trying to understand. Jen Simmons, she's a developer advocate at Mozilla, She has a wonderful YouTube video series called Layout Land, and I highly recommend that you check it out. It's very entertaining. She's not deep in the code. She's just showing what creative ideas you can do to apply using not just CSS Grid, but a whole slew of technologies that have come online about CSS, including multi-columns, CSS shapes, Flexbox. And it's quite entertaining too. It's very accessible and highly recommended. You know, there's some folks who are like Andy Clark, who's a head of creative at Stefan Nonsense, a design firm in Wales. He's written a book called Art Direction for the Web. And he's taking these new CSS technologies and applying them from a sort of editorial design perspective. And for me, he's using art direction and design to help his audience feel something. But he's very, very aware of accessibility and performance as well. What's happening is you'll see a lot of web pages that's followed this kind of very simple, not simple, but it's become a pattern where you have a headline, and you have an introductory paragraph, and then the article starts. But now with the new CSS layout tools, you're able to do quite different kind of things. You're able to do almost like magazine layouts or editorial design on the web. And we've never had, we've never had it where it could be very accessible and very performative. You can do some hacks to make some of this stuff work, but now it's intrinsic to the web. And it's an exciting time. You know, there's some wonderful kinds of ideas that he's experimenting with that I've been following quite closely, and I'm looking to adapt into my own design practice. Again, having good-looking sites doesn't mean that they're not accessible, doesn't mean that they're not fast-loading. With the new CSS, we have an opportunity to bring editorial design to the web, and with it, some sense of control, and return to the craftsmanship that we all started out with. In my design process, I think about accessibility, performance, and aesthetics. It's something that I'm learning about. It's something I am trying to explore and articulate a little bit better. And it's something that I'm definitely thinking of applying in my practice whenever I try to build a new web page. I want to thank you for letting me have the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to talking with you after this. Thank you.